The last thing I remember before the ground swallowed me was the smell of dust and something alive pressing close, something enormous, breathing slowly, standing between me and everything that wanted me dead. I didn't understand what was happening, and I wouldn't understand it for hours. But I can tell you now that it took me until I was lying in a hospital bed, staring at a ceiling fan, turning slowly in the Amboseli heat, to finally understand why. And when I did, I couldn't go back to being the person who had walked out into that savanna that morning with a resignation letter folded in his pocket. That's how long I had worked as a ranger in the Amboseli region of Kenya, patrolling the same red earth, reading the same dry wind, watching the same herds move like slow dark rivers across a landscape that never stopped being beautiful, no matter how many times I crossed it. The work had been my whole life. The early mornings, the long silences, the particular privilege of walking through a world most people only ever see in photographs. And that morning, the morning everything changed. The letter was already written, folded inside the front pocket of my shirt, waiting for me to hand it in when I got back to camp. The decision hadn't come suddenly. It had been building for months, maybe longer, the way the dry season strips the ground down to bare stone before you realize how much you've lost. I had watched the funding disappear, the poaching numbers climb, and the faces of good people burn out one by one until they left without looking back. The previous season I had lost 2 elephants I had been monitoring for 3 years to a poisoned waterhole, and no one outside our small team had even noticed. That kind of thing settles in the chest and changes the weight of every single morning when you lace up your boots. I went out alone that day because I needed the silence. There was a section of the eastern perimeter I hadn't checked in 2 weeks, and the field map showed unusual activity near the dried riverbed. Tracks, disturbances in the brush, the kind of signs that required a closer look. One line in my log covered the reason I was there: suspected snare placement, Sector 7, eastern fence. That was enough to justify the distance I was putting between myself and the camp, between myself and the decision sitting in my pocket. The savanna was already burning by 8 in the morning, the kind of heat that makes the horizon ripple like something liquid and unreal. I had been walking for nearly 3 hours when I saw her standing at the edge of the acacia grove, alone, which was unusual, watching me with the patient stillness that large elephants use when they have already made up their minds about something. She was a matriarch. I was certain of that, older than most of the individuals I tracked in this sector, her hide deeply creased by decades of dry seasons. When she turned and the morning light caught her left flank, I saw it clearly, a long, pale scar running diagonal across the skin, raised at the edges in a way that can only come from a wire snare removed surgically. I noted it, filed it somewhere in the back of my mind without really thinking, and kept walking. I had no idea yet why I was going to spend the rest of my life remembering that scar. The herd was somewhere nearby. I could feel the faint low vibration in the earth that you learn to read after enough years on foot, but I couldn't see them. She disappeared back into the tree line without hurry, and I moved on toward the eastern fence. I told myself it was a chance encounter in a region full of elephants, that it meant nothing, and I kept walking. I was wrong about that. I was wrong about nearly everything I believed that morning, and the savanna was already preparing to prove it. What I didn't know, what I couldn't have known as I continued east with the sun climbing and my water already lower than it should have been, was that she had recognized me. Not my face, not my voice, but something else that I still don't have a clean scientific word for, though I've spent a long time trying to find one. The long-term memory of elephants is among the most well-documented phenomena in wildlife research, capable of identifying individual humans decades after a single encounter. But nothing I had studied in 22 years had prepared me for what that memory was about to mean. Before the day was over, I reached the first fence marker and crouched to examine a set of prints that turned out to be 2 days old. I drank the last of my first water bottle standing in the open, where the shade of a single thorn bush offered almost nothing against the white sky pressing down. My head had started to ache in a way I recognized and should have taken seriously, but I told myself it was manageable and kept moving. The heat had a texture to it now, almost solid, and when I stood back up, the world swam at the edges for just a moment before settling back into place. By the time the dried riverbed came into view ahead of me, the horizon had started tilting at angles it wasn't supposed to. I remember thinking with a strange and eerie calm that I had made a serious mistake by not turning back an hour earlier. I remember the red earth rising up to meet me, the sound it made, the way the sky was still very blue and very bright when I hit the ground. After that, I remember nothing, only darkness, and something enormous breathing close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from its skin. There is a particular kind of silence that comes just before the body gives up, not the silence of the savanna, that wide breathing quiet I had learned to love over 2 decades, but an interior silence deep and absolute, the kind that presses in from all sides at once and makes the world outside seem very far away and very small. I know that silence now better than I know almost anything else. I fell into it somewhere between the dried riverbed and the thornbush line, and for a long time after, I didn't know whether I was going to come back out. I want to be precise about what happened physically, because I think it matters. The temperature in the eastern sector of Amboseli that afternoon had reached 41 degrees Celsius in the open, which is the kind of heat that doesn't announce itself. It simply accumulates until your body runs out of the capacity to compensate. I had consumed less than 1 liter of water in 4 hours of walking. My radio had lost signal somewhere around the second fence marker, and I hadn't stopped long enough to troubleshoot it because I had been telling myself for an hour that I was almost done and almost back and almost fine. Almost is a dangerous word in a landscape that does not negotiate. When I hit the ground, I didn't fall dramatically. I simply stopped being upright. One moment the earth was beneath my boots, and the next it was against my cheek, warm and gritty and smelling of dry grass and iron. I tried to push myself up and my arms refused. I tried to call out and produce something closer to a breath than a sound. The sky above me was white blue and enormous, the kind of sky that makes you feel how completely alone a human body can be in open land. And for a long moment I just looked at it and understood, with a clarity that fear makes sharp, that I had made a very serious mistake. The first thing I became aware of, as consciousness loosened and tightened in uneven waves, was a sound I couldn't immediately place. Low and rhythmic, coming from the ground itself, or rather through it, transmitted by the earth the way sound travels through water, arriving in the bones before the ears register it. More than one source, getting closer with a patience that didn't feel random, that felt, even in my diminished state, deliberate and measured. I pressed my palm flat against the red soil and felt it clearly. Footsteps, moving toward me from the direction of the acacia grove. Every instinct I had developed over 22 years on the ground fired at once. I knew what large animals moving in coordinated formation meant when a human was lying still on open savanna, and none of those meanings were reassuring. I tried again to move and managed to roll slightly onto my back, which is how I saw the first shadow pass across the sky above me, enormous and dark against the white brightness, blocking the sun in a way that dropped the temperature around me by several degrees in an instant. Then another shadow. The vibration in the earth became a sound I could hear with my ears, and the sound became presence, and the presence became a wall of gray-brown mass surrounding me on all sides before I fully understood what I was seeing. 6 of them I counted later from the track impressions left in the soil, moving into position around my body with a quiet efficiency that I had no framework to interpret. They didn't trumpet, didn't charge, didn't exhibit any of the threat behaviors I would have expected from a herd encountering an unfamiliar prone human in open ground. They simply arrived and arranged themselves, shoulder to shoulder, close enough that I could have reached out and touched the wrinkled skin of the nearest leg, without straightening my arm fully. I didn't reach out, I barely breathed. In my drifting half-conscious state, the rational part of my mind was trying to construct an explanation that made sense, that I had stumbled near a calf, that they were assessing a threat, that this was a stress response that would resolve an aggression within minutes. The less rational part of my mind, the part that operates on pattern and instinct and the long accumulated experience of years in the field, was receiving an entirely different signal. There was no aggression in the way they stood. No agitation in the low rumbling that passed between them. That infrasonic communication that elephants use across distances and that I was now feeling in my ribcage from a distance of less than 2 meters. What I was feeling, though I had no word for it yet, was something that resembled intention. Calm, coordinated, purposeful intention. The largest of them stood directly at my head, the position that, if I had been conscious enough to think about it clearly, corresponded to the direction from which the greatest threat would come. I could smell her, dust and grass and something musky and ancient, and when I turned my head by degrees and looked up, I saw the underside of her jaw, the slow movement of her breathing, the way she held herself absolutely still. On her left flank, the pale diagonal scar caught the afternoon light. I recognized it, the same matriarch from the acacia grove that morning. She had found me, or returned to me, and I was too far gone to understand what that meant. I closed my eyes, because there was nothing else left to do, and I let the darkness take me with the sound of her breathing overhead, and the ground vibrating with the weight of animals that had decided, for reasons I wouldn't understand until much later, that I was worth protecting. Time doesn't move the same way when the body is shutting down. It pools and stretches and folds back on itself, and the mind drifts between moments without any reliable sense of sequence or duration. I don't know how long I was fully unconscious before the fragments started coming back. Sounds first, then sensations, then the slow reassembly of the world into something I could partially interpret. What I can tell you is that every time awareness surfaced, the circle was still there. They hadn't moved. They hadn't left. And that fact, even in my diminished state, registered somewhere below thought in the place where the body decides whether or not it is safe to keep fighting. The heat was the first thing I felt returning, Not the brutal overhead heat of the open savanna, but something different. The elephants were casting shade across my body, not from any single position, but from the combined mass of 6 large animals standing in close formation around me. I learned afterward that an adult African elephant can lower the perceived ground temperature in a small enclosed area by several degrees simply through shade and the slow evaporation of moisture from their skin. At the time, lying in the red dirt with my body temperature in a range that had already begun to affect my cognition, all I knew was that the killing white heat had receded slightly, and that the difference was the difference between where I was and somewhere worse. The rumbling was continuous. That low subsonic communication that elephants produce in their chests and skulls, the infrasound that travels through earth and air simultaneously, and that researchers have documented as carrying emotional content as complex as alarm, reassurance, grief, and coordination, moved through the ground beneath me in steady pulses. I felt it more than heard it. The way you feel the bass note of a large instrument in your sternum before your ears resolve the pitch. It was not agitated. That is the detail I return to every time I try to explain what those hours felt like. The rumbling was not agitated. Whatever they were communicating to each other, it did not have the frequency of panic or threat. It had the frequency of a decision already made. I drifted again. In one of the clearer intervals, I managed to turn my head enough to see the legs of the nearest elephant, the great columnar weight of them, the skin creased and mapped with the texture of very old bark, the feet broad and flat against the earth, positioned with a deliberateness that I recognized even then as intentional spacing. They were not clustered randomly. They were arranged. The gaps between each animal were narrow enough to block passage, but not so narrow that the herd itself was compressed, a formation that, if I had been watching from above, would have looked exactly like what it was, a perimeter. A wall built from living bodies, facing outward, held in place by a collective will I had no category for. I don't know what time it was when the lion came. The light had changed. The overhead glare had shifted toward the lower, amber-edged quality of mid-afternoon, which meant I had been on the ground for at least 3 hours, possibly more. I heard the change before I understood it. The rumbling dropped in pitch and increased in frequency simultaneously, a shift so specific and immediate that even in my state, it snapped something alert in the back of my mind. Then the matriarch moved. Not away, forward, a single step toward the perimeter, her head lifting and her ears spreading wide in a display that I have seen used against vehicles, against other predators, against anything that has ever made the mistake of pressing too close. The others tightened, shoulder to shoulder, the gaps between them closing without a sound. A long silence, heavy and loaded, with nothing in it except the wind moving through dry grass somewhere distant and the low continued rumbling of the herd holding their position. Then the silence ended, not with sound but with its absence changing quality, the way it does when something large that was very close decides to move away. The matriarch settled back. The spacing reopened by degrees. The formation held. Whatever had come to the perimeter had made its assessment and retreated, and the herd had not broken and had not scattered and had not left me. I exhaled something I hadn't realized I was holding and lost consciousness again before I could finish the thought. There is a concept in elephant behavioral research called allomothering, the practice by which members of a herd take on protective and caregiving roles toward individuals outside their immediate family unit, including calves not their own, and in documented cases other species in distress. What was happening around me that afternoon existed somewhere at the outer edge of that concept and well beyond anything I had personally encountered in 22 years of fieldwork. I didn't have the word for it then. I only had the sensation that I was inside, something deliberate, something that had been decided without my knowledge or participation, and that the decision had been made in my favor. The ground vibrated, the shadows held, and somewhere above me, the matriarch with the scar on her left flank breathed slowly and did not move. Back at camp, the first indication that something was wrong arrived the way bad news usually does in the field. Quietly, and then all at once. My scheduled radio check-in was at 1300 hours. When it produced nothing but static, my colleague Daniel logged it as a possible equipment issue and waited 15 minutes before trying again. He tried the secondary frequency. By 1400 hours, with the temperature outside the main tent sitting at 40 degrees and no movement on any of the sector monitors, he stopped calling it an equipment issue and started calling it what it was: a ranger down, location unknown, eastern sector, no contact for over an hour in conditions that didn't allow for mistakes. The search protocol in Amboseli for a missing ranger operates on a tiered system designed for exactly this kind of scenario: a lone operative, failed communication, hostile environmental conditions. Daniel activated the first tier immediately. 2 vehicles dispatched to the last known GPS waypoint logged from my tracker, a third positioned at the eastern fence access road as a relay point, and a spotter request submitted to the aerial survey team that happened to be operating 30 kilometers north that afternoon. What the protocol didn't account for What no protocol I've ever read has accounted for was what they were going to find when they got there. Nothing in the training manual covers that. Nothing in 20 years of combined field experience among the three rangers in those vehicles had prepared them for the image that came through on the spotter's radio transmission at approximately 1600 hours. I have since spoken to Daniel many times about what he heard in that transmission and what happened in the vehicle in the seconds after. The spotter's voice, he told me, was completely flat, the particular flatness of someone who has understood what they are seeing but has not yet found the cognitive framework to report it professionally. The words came through the static in fragments, a cluster, possibly 6 individuals, mature herd, tight formation, and then a pause long enough that Daniel keyed the radio twice to confirm connection. Then there is a human inside the formation. Alive, I think? The herd is, they are standing around him. They are not moving either. Daniel said the 3 rangers in his vehicle looked at each other without speaking for a moment that felt much longer than it was. Then he put the vehicle in gear. What they saw when they crested the low ridge that overlooks the dried riverbed sector was something that none of them have been able to describe to me in the same way twice, which I think is its own kind of evidence for how thoroughly it exceeded their expectations. 6 elephants in a closed circle on open ground, motionless in the late afternoon light, casting long amber shadows across the red earth. From a distance of 200 meters, the formation looked almost sculptural, too deliberate to be accidental, too still to be a random convergence. Daniel stopped the vehicle and raised his binoculars and found me between the legs of the nearest animal, and he told me later that his first coherent thought was not relief, but pure bewilderment, the kind that temporarily overrides every trained response you have. The approach was the problem that nearly ended everything. Coming in too fast or too loud risked triggering a stress response from the herd. 6 adult elephants in a closed formation, approached suddenly by 2 vehicles, represented a stampede scenario with a prone human at the center of it. Coming in too slowly risked losing the last of the daylight and losing me with it, because my core temperature at that point, though none of them knew the exact number yet, had been in dangerous territory for hours. Daniel made the call. Slow approach. Engines at low idle. No sudden movements, 1 vehicle only, with the second holding position at 200 meters as a precaution. He drove the last stretch in near silence, windows down, watching the herd for any shift in posture that would tell him to stop. The matriarch turned her head when the vehicle reached 50 meters. They looked at each other, a ranger who had spent 15 years learning to read elephant behavior and a matriarch who had spent decades learning to read human intention, and something passed between them in that stillness that Daniel has never been able to fully articulate to me, except to say that after a moment she turned her head back to the perimeter and did not move again. He drove the last 50 meters at walking pace and stopped at the edge of the circle. He got out of the vehicle without closing the door. He walked the last 10 meters on foot, slowly, with his hands open at his sides, and he crouched down beside me and checked my pulse with 2 fingers against my neck, and he said my name, and I did not answer. The herd opened. That is the detail that has stayed with every person who was there, that as Daniel lifted me by the shoulders and began dragging me toward the vehicle, the elephants stepped aside, not in panic, not in retreat, but in a slow and deliberate parting, each animal shifting its weight and adjusting its position to create a corridor wide enough for a man to carry another man through. Daniel's second ranger was already out of the vehicle with the medical kit by the time they reached it. They had an IV line in my arm within 4 minutes, and the vehicle moving toward camp within 6. Daniel told me he looked in the rearview mirror once, just before the ridge blocked the view, and the herd had closed the circle again, standing in the same formation, in the same positions, in the long amber light of late afternoon, as if they were waiting for something else that still needed protecting. I woke up in the Amboseli district hospital on the morning of the second day, to the sound of a ceiling fan turning slowly overhead and a quality of light coming through the window that told me the worst was over. My core temperature had reached 39.8 degrees Celsius by the time Daniel's vehicle reached camp, close enough to the threshold where organ damage becomes irreversible that the attending physician used the word fortunate twice in the same sentence when he briefed me. 2 liters of IV fluid, monitored rest, and the specific mercy of having been found when I was found. That was the clinical summary. It said nothing about how I had been found or why. And those were the only questions I couldn't stop turning over in the long silences between vital sign checks and the shuffling of nurses past my door. Daniel came on the afternoon of the second day with a thermos of coffee and the field report he had already submitted to the Reserve Authority, a copy of which he set on the bed beside me without comment. I read it slowly. The language was professional and precise, the kind of writing you produce when you're trying to describe something accurately while knowing that accuracy alone will not make it believable. Herd of approximately 6 adult females, tight protective formation, prone human at center, formation maintained for estimated 4 to 5 hours, no aggressive behavior towards search party, voluntary withdrawal upon approach. He had written it the way you write something you witnessed and cannot explain, which is carefully and without editorializing, leaving the facts to carry whatever weight they are able to carry on their own. I read it twice and handed it back, and neither of us said anything for a moment. It was Daniel who made the connection. He had pulled the behavioral profiles for every identified matriarch in Sector 7 during the 2 days after the incident. Cross-referencing the physical description I had given him, the diagonal scar on the left flank, pale at the edges, raised against the photographic database the team had been building for 11 years. He found her in 40 minutes. Her profile entry was 4 pages long, with photographs going back 9 years, and the first notation at the top of the file read, "Rescued female, estimated age 35 to 40 years at time of intervention, snare removal and wound treatment administered in the field, full recovery confirmed at follow-up observation 6 weeks post-incident." The date of the rescue was recorded as a morning in the dry season 9 years prior. The team listed on the intervention report included my name, second from the top. I held the file for a long time without speaking. 9 years is a long span in a human life, and an even longer one in the life of a working ranger, measured in seasons and budgets and the slow accumulation of cases that start to blur together after enough of them have passed through your hands. I had been part of hundreds of field interventions over 2 decades. Snare removals, emergency treatments, confiscations, relocations, and I could not have told you before that afternoon the specific details of more than a handful of them. But I looked at the photograph of her flank in the file, and I recognized the scar the way you recognize something you saw clearly once and filed without knowing you would ever need it again. I had been there. I had helped hold the wound irrigation equipment while the lead veterinarian worked. I had watched her walk away into the bush afterward, and I had written a single line in my log about it and moved on to the next thing. She had not moved on. That is the fact I have been living with ever since. The fact that sits at the center of everything else and refuses to be reduced to coincidence or instinct or any of the other words people reach for when they want to make something extraordinary feel manageable. Elephant long-term memory research is among the most thoroughly documented areas of large mammal cognition, with confirmed recognition intervals of over a decade for both individual animals and specific human beings associated with significant events. What the research cannot fully account for is the decision. The active, coordinated, sustained decision made by a matriarch and her herd to stand in a circle around a collapsed human being for 4 to 5 hours in open savanna, in heat, against predators, until help arrived. It describes the capacity. It does not describe the will. I found the resignation letter in the front pocket of my field shirt when Daniel brought my gear to the hospital room on the 3rd day. It was folded exactly as I had left it, creased along the same lines, intact and legible and completely unpersuasive. I unfolded it and read it once, and then I folded it again and held it for a moment, thinking about the man who had written it, and the morning he had walked out into the savannah with it sitting against his chest like a decision already made. I thought about the matriarch standing at the edge of the acacia grove that morning, watching me with the patience of an animal that had already decided something I hadn't yet understood. I thought about the scar on her flank, which I had noted and filed and forgotten, and which she had apparently carried forward through 9 years of dry seasons and migrations, and everything the savannah had asked of her, until the morning it meant something different than I had thought. I tore the letter in half. Then I tore it again. I set the pieces on the bedside table and looked at the ceiling fan turning slowly in the heat, and understood, with a completeness I had not felt in years, exactly where I was supposed to be. The same place I had always been, the same red earth, the same enormous sky, the same herds moving like slow dark rivers across a landscape that had just reminded me, in the most unambiguous terms available to it, that the work was not finished. That I was not finished. The matriarch had known it before I did. She had stood over me in the white heat of the afternoon and held the circle until someone came. And when someone came, she had stepped aside, and when they drove away, she had closed the formation again, as if she had always known it would end this way. As if, 9 years ago she had filed the information and simply waited for the morning she would need it.